So people are starting to filter in there. So I'm going to give people a second, but I'm also going to use the time to welcome you to our latest Simon Talk. This Simon Talk focuses a little bit on the budget, but actually has a broader theme. I think, people will have seen, or for those of you who follow closely, might have seen our reaction to the budget, and particularly on the housing spending side. And oftentimes we do these and just kind of reflect again on what was in the budget. I think there's been a lot of reflection on what's been in the budget, and obviously conversation has kind of moved on to who's going to be the next government or when's the election going to be, and so on and so forth. Our speaker today is Nat O'Connor. And Nat is, if I can find my page, so as I don't do his bio an injustice, Nat is assistant professor in social policy at in UCD's School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice, and a member of the UCD Geary Institute for Public Policy. Nat is also a senior policy advisor to Age Action and chairperson of the Irish Social Policy Association. He's worked in the Oireachtas for the Labour Party and the think tank Task at the Ulster University and Maynooth University, and in a lifetime ago in the Homeless Agency, and that's where Nat and I would have originally met. He has a master's degree from Dundee University, Scotland, and a PhD from Trinity College Dublin. His recent publications, which are very relevant to his talk today, is What Would It Take to Eliminate Consistent Poverty by 2030? And that was for the Community Platform. And Ireland's Public Spending Explained 2024. And that's really what this talk today is about. It's the budget in context, in the context of the in excess of 100 billion that the state is going to spend next year, and looking at how that's going to impact or has the potential to prevent or and impact homelessness. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Nat. If you are on social media and you're tweeting about this, please do, or whichever your social media of choice, use the hashtag Simon Talks, and then we can track you, or indeed link us in at simon.ie. The format of the talk will be, it's usually 25 to 30 minutes, and followed by a Q&A. So as we're talking along, you'll see there's a Q&A button and a chat button at the bottom of the screen. If you have a thought or a point of clarification you want, just bang them in as they're coming to you. I will curate the questions at the end and pass them on to Nat. So if you want to get them down as they occur to you, please do, or wait till the end as is your preference. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nat. Thanks, Nat.
Thanks very much, Wayne. And thanks to the Simon community for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully everybody will be able to see that. And I just get that going now. So hopefully Perfect. That's visible to everybody. So as Wayne said, I'm looking here at Budget 2025 in context and thinking about the kind of the other spending programs that help us prevent homelessness and help us reduce homelessness. So it's not just the direct spending on homeless services, but it's that wider picture. So the root of this comes from a report which was published earlier this year by the UCD Geary Institute for Public Policy, and you can get a copy on publicpolicy.ie, which is Ireland's Public Spending Explained 2024. And in that report, I identified 114 billion euro worth of public spending. So that's a larger amount of money than you see announced during the budget, because it includes what's called non-voted spending, such as our payments towards the national debt or our contribution to the EU budget and so on. And it also included local government funding, because local government can raise and spend its own money, which is not part of the national budget process. And in this report, I identified 105 areas where we spend money. And I'm not going to go into that today, but rather than just talking about, say, health spending, I broke it down into acute hospital spending, spending for older persons, spending for disability, spending on mental health, which are broken down in the HSE's National Service Plan and so on. And when we start talking about things in that more specific way, about spending programs, the hope is that we can really get into sort of the nuts and bolts. Because when we talk about health spending going out of control or housing spending increasing, it's too vague as to where that goes. So this idea of a spending program is just a key idea to help us get a better grip on where all the money is going to, particularly now that we have these national budgets which are spending over 100 billion. There's a real need to tighten our focus on, where is all this money going to? So that's the first idea. The second idea, which is just really a visual story here to state the obvious, when the government has money, in an ideal scenario, it's going to direct that money towards improving services, building more houses in the case of homelessness, and, improving things, generally speaking. And it's not going to spend a lot of money on, what's already there. The difficulty we have with homeless services, and it's always been the case, is that, what happens when a house goes on fire? Obviously, a lot of resources are immediately focused to deal with that fire, and we have less money to focus on future development. And this, if you like, is an analogy for the situation of homeless services and for other sort of acute emergency type services. It's a permanent emergency with homelessness because there are so many families, so many children who are homeless, and that number is going up. We're constantly firefighting. We're constantly putting in money to just deal with today's homeless service requirements. And so there's not enough money going in to prevent homelessness and indeed to put in place the housing we need and other services we need to get people out of homelessness in bigger numbers. Obviously, many people do leave homelessness every year, but more come in. And so it's about how can we sort of shift the focus to that wider prevention and reduction piece. So that's just a second idea to give to you there. The economy has been doing very well. I mean, since the crash, by about 2015, 2016, the economy was beginning to recover, and Ireland has had, exceptional levels of economic growth since then. And particularly when you look across the rest of Northwest Europe, the Irish population is growing very fast. As a result of that, the Irish economy is going very well. The multinational sector, which is so important to the Irish economy, has been really having a boom, particularly that of the tech sector. And as a result of that, we have a great growth in the Irish economy. Unfortunately, it's not the case that simply having a growing economy means we're going to be able to solve problems such as homelessness. In fact, with the growth in population and other pressures, we see that homelessness has continued to increase as well. A key point on this, of course, is that COVID-19 led to some changes. There was some slight slowdown in the economy, although it is remarkable in the Irish context how much the economy just kept going, despite the fact of a massive amounts of layoffs and unemployment and people temporarily out of work during COVID. Nonetheless, we really bounced back after that experience. We did manage to make significant improvements in terms of the homelessness situation during COVID, the kind of an emergency response. More money was put in. And certain factors obviously changed in terms of the drivers that were sending people into homelessness. But no sooner than we come out of the pandemic, then we see that homelessness continues to rise again. So that's obviously a concern. So that's just to remind ourselves of where we're at in the Irish context. The economy is going really well. We can't realistically expect the economy to go an awful lot better in terms of both the level of growth, the level of job growth, the low level of unemployment in the Irish economy. And so if the economy is going as well as it can, really we have to focus in then on, what are we doing in terms of the government programs to deal with the prevention of homelessness, to deal with actual current homelessness, and then of course that reduction piece. What do we need to put in place? So here is the spending on accommodation for homelessness. And as we've seen, that has, if you were to draw a line through this, it's gone up in the period between 2018 and 2025. I'm sure most of you are very much aware of that. From about 120,000, or sorry, rather 120 million euro back in 2018, we've seen a height of about over 300 million spent on homeless accommodation coming out of COVID, but it has fluctuated on a year-to-year basis, and it very much is meeting need. So it's demand driven, and the amount of money going in is to meet need. We did put in a lot more money in 2020 to deal with the COVID situation, and that saw a positive result. but we didn't sustain that level of spending coming out of COVID, and then we had to put it back again in 2023. So there is a question mark over what we're doing in terms of spending money on homeless accommodation. Obviously, we're meeting the need, but we're not necessarily getting ahead of the situation. There's two other factors I want to bring in when we're talking about money. We're in an unusual situation when we're talking about Irish public spending. And there is a difficulty when we look at spending in 2018 or 2016 or whatever it might be and compare it with spending today. It's only been 8 years since 2016, and yet we've had inflation of over 25%. It's simply the case that the euro in your pocket doesn't have the same spending power that it had before. And in fact, if you had €100 today, that'll buy you, a little over what €80 would have bought you back in 2018. So that's a huge change to the value of money. And so when we're thinking about public spending, despite the fact we're talking about billions, we have to take into account of inflation. And this is something we haven't had to do with the public spending accounts since the 1980s. We had a little bit of it in the Celtic Tiger period just before the crash, where again, the value of money was going down because everything was getting so expensive. But now, the last couple of years, it's once again a salient factor. So we just have to take it into account. The other thing which is also new is that the population has grown enormously. So the projected population of Ireland, according to the Central Statistics Office, has gone up by 12% in the period January 2018 to the end of next year. And that's an extra nearly 600,000 people in the Irish economy. And a lot of public spending is on a kind of per capita basis, per person basis. So we have to take account of those changes as well when we think about, are we really spending more money or is it less money? So for example, if I go back to our spending on homeless accommodation, the nominal spending, which is the top line there in dark blue, would show us a 161% increase in spending in monetary terms between 2018 and 2025. But when we adjust that by the population increase, that the population is naturally getting bigger. So if you have the same percentage of people who are homeless, you just need more money for homeless services. So if you put in that adjustment, you bring down the spending on homeless accommodation to 133% increase. Still an increase, but it's not quite as big. If you adjust for inflation, which has been the 25% inflation in this period, the extra amount we're spending on homeless accommodation goes down to 109% increase. So it's still more than double what we were spending before, but it is a lot less than 161% increase. And of course, the blue line at the bottom tells us when we adjust for both of these things, for population and for inflation, suddenly we see quite a different picture in terms of our spending on homeless accommodation. There is an increase, there's an 86% increase, but that's a lot less than you might think. In fact, it's half of the level of increase that you would think of if you just looked at the nominal figures. So whereas nominally we're spending over 300 million, in comparative terms, compared to 2018, in 2018 it was about 120 million, and we're spending about 220 million in the same in 2018 value euro. So this gets a bit head-wrecking because we have to remember, well, are we talking about today's euro or yesterday's euro or whatever? In this case, when we're talking about adjustment for inflation, so that's the orange line and the blue line at the bottom, these are both in 2018 value euro. So that's, again, an important caveat when thinking about public spending. The next thing I want to touch on, just for example, are 3 other programs that help us prevent and reduce homelessness. So we're not just looking at the cost this year of homeless accommodation, which is very much the firefighting. So to remind you of that example, that's the money we put in to sort of put out the flames, to give people emergency accommodation now and to pay for the staff and supports for people who are currently in the situation of homelessness. But obviously we need to look at the bigger picture. We have had an increase in housing, and these are all nominal figures again. So this is the figures as published in the budget. So we see the amount of money spent on housing has gone up from 2 million in 2018 to around 4.7 million next year allocated in the budget. So that's a huge 136% increase, more than doubled. 136% higher number in 2015 than it was in 2018. If we look at child and family supports, which is mostly money going to TUSLA to support obviously situations where social workers may need to go in to support families or to look after children's welfare and safeguarding and so on. Spending on that area has gone up, as you can see, by 45% in the period from 2018 to 2025. And finally, a much smaller budget is the budget going to community development, which was a couple of $100 million in 2018, and it's gone up to nearly 300 million in 2025, and that's the community development budget up 74%. So, as I said, this is all nominal changes, but you can see how each of these things plays an important role in terms of both preventing and reducing homelessness. The money spent on community development, the money spent on children and family support, some of that work no doubt will help us prevent homelessness. And these are core parts of the way in which the state supports communities, but also families who are in difficult situations. And these are key supports. And the money spent on housing, quite obviously, we need a lot more housing in this country. Succession of reports that said that. And so we need to, part of that is the role of the state in building housing and the size of the housing budget. But crucially, when we adjust by inflation and population, we get a slightly different picture. In the previous diagram, housing is up 136% as a nominal increase, but we see in real terms, and all the euro values on this diagram are in 2018 terms. So this is how much your euros would buy you if you were back in 2018. And in those terms, the housing budget is still up. It's up 69% in 2025 compared to 2018. So that's, if you like, a real term increase. But the level of increase is a lot less stark than you might think. It's no longer doubled. It's more than 2/3 bigger next year than it was in 2018. If we look at children and family support, it's only up 3.3%. So when you take into account the growing population, when you take into account inflation and the lower value of money, what we see is the money going to children and family support is pretty much the same next year that it was in 2018. And indeed, because of the public pay agreements, more money is going into pay next year. So there would be a worry there that we're actually going to see a contraction in actual service delivery in terms of children and family support. So that would be one where that'd be a concern, because if we're trying to prevent people going to homelessness and we're not really investing in children and family support, that's possibly a vulnerability there in the broader system that we need to look at. Could we prevent more homelessness if we gave a bit more money to TUSLA? That's just the question. And if we look at community development, there has been an increase, but in the previous diagram, it looked like it was 74%. But in real terms, when you take into account population growth and also inflation, it's an increase of 24%. That's still a fairly significant increase. So it's a good level of investment going on in community development, but it's not as big as it might look in nominal terms. So that's the key message, I suppose, I want to deliver, that, we do need to look at these programs, but we also need to be, wise in terms of what do the numbers really mean when you take into account inflation and population change. The other area which I want to look at, which is an obvious core support for people who are in homelessness, is the weekly welfare, whether it's disability allowance or job seekers allowance or whatever else. When it comes to welfare, it doesn't make sense to talk about population change, because the weekly welfare is not a per capita or per person spending. So we're simply looking at the rate, and then we're going to look at inflation. So if you look at the nominal rate of weekly welfare, in 2018, you got 198 euro in your pocket, and that has gone up steadily, particularly in the last couple of years. And we got the 12 euro starting from next January, so weekly welfare will be 244 euro. There was some news reporting that there was a wobble in government about this, but all welfare payment have received that 12 euro. But when we bring in inflation, what we see is that in 2018 terms, which is the spending power of this money compared to what you could buy in 2018, weekly welfare has gone down nearly every year. It was more or less the same in 2019. There wasn't much inflation. In fact, in 2020, there was a slight decrease in prices. So the value of that money actually went up slightly. But once the inflation started kicking in from 2021, 22, 23, what we see is a decrease in the spending power of the money. And the rate is going up from 2022 onwards, and yet it's spending, it's not going up by enough to compensate for the level of inflation that we've seen. And only in 2025 are we, when the spending power of the weekly welfare is now back to 195 euro 20 cent, it's nearly back to what it was in 2018. But actually, if you went around the shops with a shopping basket, you will have less going in to your shopping trolley in 2025 than you would have been able to buy in 2018. So that's the reality with weekly welfare. And you can see the values contrasted here. So although the nominal rate in the blue bar is going upwards, that, the nominally we're getting more, a higher amount of money, that spending power in the orange bar, is dipped down and is not even back to what it was in 2018. Now, it is important to acknowledge that there are one-off payments, not only the Christmas bonus, but there's an additional bonus week. If you're on the fuel allowance, there's a bonus payment. If you're on disability allowance, there's a bonus payment, and so on. Certainly in terms of the state pension, you can add up the total value of those bonus payments, and it does not compensate for the lost spending power, but it does bridge the gap to a certain extent, but it doesn't go the whole way. And in many cases, people on job seekers allowance are not entitled to a lot of those one-offs. So the core welfare is down. And of course, we would expect for people who are in homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness, not having an adequate weekly income is going to be crucial in terms of people's ability to pay their rent wherever they might be, to stay out of homelessness. So that's a crucial concern. And of course, rents haven't stood still. Rents have gone up a lot in this 7-year period. So what does this all mean? There's a few things that I'd like to draw out. One, we've had this rapid change, but you can see hopefully this S curve, often talked about in different types of statistics. We were cruising along with low inflation for a very long time. And then we had this sudden period of very high inflation, but that's tailing off again, like the top of a letter S. And so that you can sort of see we're heading into the new normal. Prices are going to settle at the new normal of higher prices. Rent prices are probably going up more steeply, but certainly food, household energy, and so on, we expect that to stabilize. Public spending has likewise gone up enormously, from core public spending of 32 billion in 2018 to 69 billion in 2025. But we've been through a period of rapid change. We do need to take into account the inflation and the population change when thinking, to what extent is this explosion in public spending a real thing, or is it to do with inflation and population change? And what we find is a bit of both, that some of it is explained by simply, the inflation, meaning you need to spend more money, and likewise a larger population, meaning you've more tax coming in, but you do need to spend more money. And those things have happened very rapidly. But there is also real term increase in public spending. We are spending more as a state and a government than was the case previously. The second thing is to say there has been very real investment in housing. Despite, taking into account population change and inflation, we are actually spending more on housing now in 2025 than was the case in 2018. So that's very welcome for obvious reasons. We need to increase output to get more housing units built. But as we saw earlier, not all spending programs have seen the same level of investment, and core welfare rates are down. So some of the supports such as TUSLA or weekly welfare that help people, prevent people from going into homelessness are not as strong as they could be, and we could do more to invest in those services. Arguably, both welfare and TUSLA spending is down effectively. So that's creating a situation where it's perhaps more likely that people are going to go into homelessness because of this kind of weaker social supports or a weaker safety net there. And we see the evidence in the sense that homelessness is still increasing year on year. So just the figures here, spending on housing in real terms is still up 69%, and spending on homeless accommodation is up 86% in real terms. Spending on community development is also up by 24%, and that's all welcome, real increase, which should help in the both prevention and reduction of homelessness. but spending on children and family is only up 3%. And in reality, I'd say that's a decrease when you take into account higher public pay, and welfare rates are down. And that's a major concern. And the final point, which is really just a set of questions to pose, for a long time, we just assume, look, we're going to spend more money. And the government is always happy to tell us we're spending more. And obviously, in something like housing, we do need to spend more. We need higher output. And that's straightforward. But when it comes to these other areas of public spending, these spending programs, such as child and family supports, such as community development, we have to look beyond money, because the economy is going as well as it can be. We can't expect the economy to grow even further to bring in even more taxation. We have to look at the amount of money we've got and say, well, what are we, should we divide this money differently, move it between different headings? Are we getting value for money? Or do we need to look beyond the question of spending money, such as, for example, other areas of decision making? The allocation of social housing is obviously one that's been talked about for a long time, but we may need to come back to that with a stronger focus and say, look, other countries have done more to say, if you're homeless, particularly if you're long-term homeless, we'll give you priority to access social housing. And we don't do that to the same extent as other jurisdictions. And so we could spend a whole lot more money on housing and all the rest of it. But if we're not looking at allocations, we may just be missing a core policy change that's necessary if we're going to see a significant reduction in the numbers of people who are homeless. And that would be politically difficult and potentially quite unpopular as a decision. But if we're serious about tackling homelessness, then that's the kind of decision we need to look at. And unfortunately, the other question I have to pose is, what happens if and when the economy slows down? I don't mean we go into recession, but if it just slows down, and if things like the tax money coming in stops growing as quickly as it has grown in recent years, if the corporation tax, for example, that windfall tax, which we're told again and again is temporary, well, if that does begin to fade away because other European Union countries want their share, or for whatever reason, where Ireland is part of these international processes that agree to a fairer international corporation tax system, and having signed up to that, we're going to have to come good on that promise at some point, and that means there will be less money. The risk is, even in the boom times now, with so much money coming in, welfare has been cut in real terms. Child and family supports are barely breaking even, and I think they're really cut as well, as I've described. So when the economy slows down or there's less tax money, the great risk is we will reverse on those key services that are preventing homelessness and that are helping people get out of homelessness. And that's a big risk. And so I think we need to look at that as well as part of our consideration. So these are some thoughts on the spending programs, kind of the wider spending programs around homelessness. And I'll stop there, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thanks for that, Nat. The Q&A in the chat box there are available. Please do ask questions. That was strikingly clear in your analysis. So thank you for taking so much time to put that together. It's a very clear pathway, and as we were talking about before we went live, it's very much the beginning of a conversation rather than coming to absolute conclusions, or I think rather it's kind of laying out the information with which we have to grapple if we're going to come to conclusions and the new direction that we want. And I think it's particularly timely in the view that in a few months' time we'll have a new government. We're going to be grappling with those same kind of distribution questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the rationale for the report I wrote on public expenditure is just that we take a closer look at where money is being spent. Because if you think about the last budget, we had weeks of coverage telling us this is going to be a giveaway budget. And we had on the day ministers listing off all the areas that are getting more money. And so you could go away thinking, sure, everything got more money. But when you peel away the kind of spin and the public relations stuff, you start to see actually some of these long-term trends, like for TUSLA, it's strange. Why has that area not seen an increase? This government has a long-stated commitment to child poverty, to eliminating child poverty, or at least reducing it drastically. And there's a commitment to taking 60,000 children out of long-term poverty. and yet weekly welfare is down and money for TUSLA is down. So that doesn't add up. And so that's the kind of questioning I think that needs to be brought into focus, rather than just, how did the budget affect the money in your pocket, which is the classic, the information it's most of the information that we get in the 24 hours after the budget.
Hmm. We have our first question here, and it's actually a question about your question at the end. In which area does Nat believe we may not be getting value for money at present?
Well, the easy one to say is the building of children's hospitals. Um, and you could be very cynical about that, but that project went badly wrong. It's now the most expensive building, or one of the most expensive buildings ever built. It's costing more than the Burj Khalifa, that kind of kilometer high tower in Dubai. And so that's a warning sign there that our ability to manage these kind of large scale projects is at question. And if we're going to build housing on scale, if we're going to build, 5, 10,000 housing units, if we're going to build larger social housing developments, our ability to both bring those projects home at a reasonable price is a question. We've seen that with modular homes, which ended up being more expensive than we thought. So again and again, the state has, even when you're tendering and going out to commission them from private developers, they're coming in at a high unit cost. So that's a big issue. Can we do this? And if we can't, what do we need to do with our public agencies, Department of Housing, Department of Public Spending, and so on, to increase our capacity to deal with large scale capital projects? So that'd be the first one. Other areas, I mean, it's very hard to say. Obviously, we do deliver a fairly efficient public service. That's not just me saying that. The OECD has analysed the Irish civil service on a couple of occasions, and they find that it's small for our size, and but relatively efficient in how it operates. Now, you can always look for improvements, and I think the reform agenda has gone off the boil in Ireland. We've a Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, but I'm not sure what has got reformed in the last few years. I think we need to go back to that. There used to be a lot more focus on openness and transparency and open government. That seems to have gone backwards. And certainly when I've gone looking for certain documents in recent times, oh, you have to put in an FOI request. You can't get access to things easily. We should be publishing stuff more openly so we can have conversations about where money is being spent. And I could go on, but that gives you some suggestions.
So the next question from Carly is, do we have a sense of what percentage of funding is going into homelessness prevention and how that breaks down in terms of prevention of chronic traditional homelessness as well as for family homelessness? Has this increased, and what would be needed to make an impact? That might be a bit granular for...
The answer is no. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because something like homelessness prevention is really conceptual. And it's just very hard to say, every time TUSLA makes an intervention, how often is that going to resolve homelessness or not? We don't know. Or if somebody gets medical treatment for a mental health issue or for addiction or whatever it might be, a certain percentage of cases that will also be preventing homelessness, but we just don't know what percentage. So all we can do is, like I was doing here, look at the overall spending. Like mental health spending is up, that's good. But family and children support, less so. So we can only look at these spending programs and begin to paint a picture. But at least by looking at spending programs rather than just the whole Department of Health as a whole, we can come closer to answering that question.
Yeah. The one additional I'd add to that is an awful lot of the increase in spending on homeless services has been spent on providing more private emergency accommodation. And that's by necessity rather than any grand plan. And I think that speaks to your other thing about, are we looking at where we're actually putting the resources? Because if we were to spend more money on prevention, we mightn't have spent quite as much on the emergency accommodation and thinking about prevention in that holistic way. So Carly, thank you for that question. I think it was a really important one.
Yeah, for sure. And the data I presented at the beginning, the very first graph of homeless accommodation, is literally that. It's the line item from the Department of Housing spending just on accommodation for people who are homeless. And so that's not doing anything else other than dealing with the immediate demand. That's the burning house scenario. So we have to look outside of that to find the money going to prevention.
Yeah. And also it's all funneled through the local authorities. So that's where it gets split up as well. And you have to add in HSE funding, and yeah, so it get when you get down into the granularity, which we should, but maybe for another day. But so you have to start thinking about those. But that's part of this conversation. The next question. Thank you, Nat. How about adjusting the spend on homeless services for the increase in the homeless population? So rather than doing it by inflation and general population.
Yeah, you could do. I don't have the figures to hand in the sense that I could look at the figures that are published on total number of people or children who are in homelessness. But what you'd like to see are the family units who are in homelessness to be able to do a proper spend per household analysis. But you could do something crude by just looking at the homeless figures and dividing out the homeless accommodation, and you'll probably see that the cost per unit is changing. But the difficulty there is um, the cost per unit is also different for private emergency accommodation compared to some charities, compared to what the state might pay to maintain a unit. So it could be produced, but actually the Department of Housing or the DRCD, would be better placed to produce those numbers. And then you're talking about unit cost, and that would be a good conversation. Because let's talk about what does it cost to provide a household or a person with homeless accommodation for the year. And we can talk about value for money in that context. Um, we can also talk about whether people are shaving off costs and providing subpar accommodation because they're squeezing it too tightly. Um, but that's as far as the figures would let us go at the moment.
Um, Carly, came back. The latest department figures on homelessness show that 58% of all families in emergency accommodation are headed by a lone parent. Only a quarter of all families with children are one-parent families. What measures should we be demanding from the next government to begin to make a meaningful impact and bring this significant percentage down?
Well, Wayne mentioned earlier the other report I wrote recently, which is, how can we eliminate consistent poverty by 2030? And this was a joint effort by lots of people in the community platform. Um, and that report goes through in detail the structural issues, the reasons why some people, such as people with disability or lone parents, have a much higher rate of poverty than other people. And we have to start looking at the cost of childcare. We have to start looking at the reality that if you're a single earner family, like a lone parent family, you don't have half the costs of a couple. You have 70, 80, 90% of the same costs because you have to heat a home, you have to pay for housing, and it's more or less the same costs. So we're not doing enough to deal with the low incomes and the income inadequacy of single parent households. It's as simple as that. Um, Now, it's not as easy as saying, oh, the state should step in and spend all that money. We may have to look at support payments from partners who have, separated a role, particularly for men, to pay more towards their children. But this has been known for decades that if you're looking at poverty, lone parents are particularly high risk of poverty, and it's no surprise that lone parents are more likely to come into homelessness. And that's the fulfillment of what we were saying for decades. This is where there's concentration of poverty. So there's a lot we need to do to deal with that as an issue. I'd also like to see the state, renew its commitment to poverty um, by bringing back a combat poverty agency or something like it, to just keep banging on about these things, because we've lost focus on the whole issue of poverty. The state has talked a lot about child poverty, but it's glossing over the fact that children are not in poverty in isolation. They're in poverty in households, including in lone parent households. So you have to deal with the whole household if we're going to get at child poverty.
Absolutely. And actually, that leads into the next question: was does not think we also need to apply a gender lens to budget analysis? Lone parents are the majority headed by women, and family homelessness is also very gendered.
Yes. And if you look in the UCD report, Public Spending Explained, there's a piece there on gender analysis, which talks about the tools that already exist. And the National Women's Council have done some work on gender budgeting, and the state has a commitment to that. And there is if you like, a growing science of gender budgeting, not just saying it's a good idea, but saying, well, how do we actually crunch the numbers in a way that makes sense? And there's no doubt that poverty is gendered. Women are more likely to be in poverty than men, particularly in consistent poverty. Um, Driven by the fact that women are more likely to head lone parent households. That's the main decider. Also, in older age, women are more likely to be in poverty than men, particularly when they're living alone. So that phenomenon of living alone, keeps emerging as a correlates with poverty very strongly. But there's lots of ways in which we need to look at a gendered lens. And if we look at the fact that spending for TUSLA hasn't increased to the same extent as spending in other areas, you could do a gender analysis of that and say, that probably won't have helped women. And other areas of spending, I think we'll see a much bigger increase. That money could have gone towards more supports for women, particularly lone parents.
Yeah, and actually the TUSLA number really jumped out at me because it seems to me as a relatively new agency, it probably came in underfunded in the first instance. I think it's largely agreed it did, and if it hasn't been keeping pace, and once you add in kind of wage increases into it, I mean, in terms of the services that they have the capacity to provide, it's very concerning, that trajectory that you've outlined.
And yet at the same time, it is a big ticket item, TUSLA. I mean, that's €1 billion. So in a way, you're looking more than 1% of public spending is going on child and family supports. So we really should be making sure we get value for money in this. And as you say, if it is underfunded, there's no point setting this thing up to fail. If it needs an extra, whatever, 50,000, 100,000 to make it function correctly, then we should be making those investments, because it will cost us more in the long term to deal with the long-term effect of children brought up in poverty, young people coming into the world in a situation of poverty. Their life opportunities will be worse, but there's a cost to that in terms of the loss to the economy, but also interventions from Gardaí, criminal justice, and all the rest of it that are more likely to occur when people are brought up in adverse situations of poverty.
Okay. And the figures that you've outlined are we've gone through that a few times. It's very much the spending programs, but the other one was the social welfare spend, and as you say, it's kind of almost, it's a few euro, which when you talk about it is kind of 15% down on what it was in 2018, roughly speaking. But I was just wondering, the basket of goods that somebody is buying, and particularly the cost of food, that the inflation in that area, and the cost of fuel. Obviously, there's been some regulation in the cost of heating and fuel and whatever. And given that people on low incomes tend to be not in the AAA rated housing, that actually the impact of that €15 real loss in income, 15% a real loss in weekly income in your core payment, the impact of that is probably much more significant.
Yes, it is. And so you could do a few different things, but one is to look at the work by the Vincentian Centre, which is now part of SVP, looking at the minimum essential standard of living. And they will show that, because they're focusing in on the things that people actually buy, the groceries and so on, and they're looking at the cheapest possible cost in the discount supermarkets, they show there's a higher level of cost increase than just from overall inflation. The CSO likewise publishes its own figures to show that inflation affects people in lower incomes more, because food and energy are a larger part of their weekly basket, and so they're hit harder by inflation. So there's a number of ways in which you could crunch those numbers to show actually the weekly welfare is even worse than we thought it was. And the gap for pensioners is worse. They started from a higher position, but you'd now need an extra €18.59 on top of the €12 next year for your pension to have the same spending power that it had in 2020. So there's that extent of loss of income. For job seekers, it's a little bit better because they start from a lower base and they got down up again, but you'd still need an extra fiver at least on top of the 12 just to have the same spending power. And remember, wages have gone up. The actual living, people's expectations for a standard of living have gone up a lot in the last 7 years. But if you're on welfare, you're not even back at the spending power you had in 2018. So that leads to a bigger social gap between people who are waged and people who cannot work due to disability, due to caring, because of retirement, or whatever it might be. That's a growing gap, and that leads to social cohesion problems. And it's no surprise, I think, that if you look across our society right now, there is a crisis of social cohesion, and people are turning to extremist groups who claim to have the solution, that blame the foreigners or blame migrants and so on, which is obviously very negative, but it's very dangerous. And I think we're going to see that play out in the next election. And it's not a complete answer, but part of the answer is we're not giving enough money to people who are disadvantaged. We're not investing enough in the poorest communities. That has to have a consequence. And social cohesion is one of those consequences. Of course, it's social cohesion is a hard thing to measure, but certainly the political reaction we're seeing is something that we can measure. And I think we should join the dots to see, look, part of that is economic, that people are being left behind.
Yeah, and it occurs just to as we think about homelessness in that context as well, that actually that drop as for people generally it's people on low incomes who end up in homelessness. Often they're on social welfare, but it can be that the loss of a job and uh, you know be unable to pay rent. Now there's things like the housing assistance payment and rent supplements that support people. So it's not that somebody is a month's paycheck away from ending up in homelessness. But if that drop is more and more significant, even if you're on a relatively low income, from being on a low income into social welfare and being able to manage that transition, that has to put additional pressure. So as we're seeing the sort of minimum wage go up and low income households go up, even if they're keeping pace with inflation, the drop if they were to lose their employment, and that speaks to your hypothesis about where do we go if the economy stabilizes or even has a fall of some level without necessarily talking about the sort of recession. I think that should be something we consider more and more because they're the pressures that lead to homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. And what other countries have done is benchmarking and indexation. So Ireland is the only country in the OECD that doesn't benchmark its state pension formally, which is to say that the state pension would move automatically in line with either inflation or average earnings in the economy or both or some combination of them both. Um, so we're unusual that we have a very politicized state pension. And so that's a kind of I'm always concerned when Ireland is the only country that's doing something different. Unfortunately, sometimes it's a good thing, but often it's not to the advantage of people on lower incomes. Um, Other countries also benchmark core welfare, whether it's disability or job seekers or whatever, likewise linking it to inflation or linking it to average earnings. The ideal in the long term is to link everything to average wages, because that's a true measure of the standard of living that people enjoy in our economy. And if you think about rent, which is a key concern for preventing homelessness,
Mm.
rent is not going to be driven by welfare. It's going to be driven by average wages, because it's, what the average worker can afford, that's what's going to get charged in rent. And if the gap between welfare and average wages grows and grows, then you're somebody who's on welfare, such as disability, has less and less of a chance of getting a look in to the private rented sector. And so it's all very technical, but having these technical links between inflation and average earnings and welfare and so on is really important, because that's how you build a robust safety net. So when you get the shock, like we had a shock of the energy prices, that the safety net has the built-in resilience to deal with that. And it's expensive, but actually, what's more expensive? The long-term cost of poverty, or the short-term cost of making sure people have a decent standard of living. And of course, the thing about welfare is people spend it in the economy. It comes straight back again. It comes back in taxation. It comes back through, keeps people employed all around the country. So it is, it's not as if that money vanishes. And it doesn't, so that the headline cost is a lot, higher than the actual cost when you consider how much of that money comes back to the government again.
Yeah, and I suppose to bring it back right to the start, if you think about housing, and particularly I'm thinking of the Housing Commission proposal that social housing levels would increase to 20% of housing stock. That is part of the argument for that, and sort of looking at places like Vienna, is that does create that safety net of secure, affordable accommodation that acts as sort of a social infrastructure that you have
Yeah.
built, that means that actually social welfare rates have more play in them
Yeah,
and more
that's
value.
a really important point. And it comes back to the sort of one of the conclusions at the end there, which is it about money really, or do we have to look beyond money? Because if we assume social housing is only going to be 10% of the housing stock forever, that's not realistic. We have 30, 40% of workers are in low pay. We've 1.5 million people on a weekly welfare payment due to disability or old age or whatever. So you've got a whole lot of people on low incomes. If you look at that evidence, as the Housing Commission did, then they're saying 20% of our housing stock needs to be social. And in order to get there, we need to obviously have a bigger proportion of social housing and a big catch-up program to get there. But we also have to look at allocations. That other jurisdictions have really focused their allocations on homelessness, on old age, on disability to an extent that we haven't. And we're kind of dancing around the obvious solution to some of the homelessness that we have. We're just not willing to pay the political price of doing that, because it may not be popular locally, because people are waiting for social housing, people on low incomes who feel this is their only chance of having a home, and indeed they may see it as a path to home ownership through the tenant purchase. So you have to disappoint those people in order to address homelessness, and these are the trade-offs that are politically difficult.
Yeah, I think that one in particular is the political system isn't ready to grab that particular nettle. Sorry, another question here. Which is I think a proposal that has been put forward by a number of commentators, could the appointment of a state-led builder help cut the overall cost of tendering private companies to build social and affordable housing? Also, stocking construction materials.
That's a great question. And in fact, there's multiple parts to that question. Certainly the state could step in. The housing market, you could argue that there's a market failure because increasingly people can't afford housing and there's not enough housing. And the incentives, if I'm a developer with a lot of land, my incentive is to hang on to that land and only bring a small amount out at a time to maximize my return. Whereas what the state needs is for a whole lot of land to be made available to push down the price of land and to get more units built, even at a lower unit cost. So what the market wants versus what the state and the people need is quite different. So the state needs to intervene. So there's a few parts. To start with the last part of the question, could the state stockpile construction materials? Yes. Buying in bulk makes sense. So stocking up on steel. Steel has gone very expensive. It's hard to get enough steel for construction. That's an issue. So the state could certainly step in with a scheme. We'd have to look at EU rules to see whether that would be a sort of how you do that. But there's nothing stopping the state, I think, making a massive purchase in building materials and then selling it and selling it freely to anyone who wants to buy it. That might just help suppress costs across the housing system. There's going to be a massive lack of building materials. Assuming we see an end to the war in Ukraine and war in the Middle East, there's a massive rebuilding job there that's going to suck in building materials for 10 years or more. And that's, going to make all these we know building materials are going to remain expensive. The state might also have a role in looking at regulation. At the moment, we say these are the materials you must use. But the Japanese have had some successes using forms of bamboo instead of steel that can actually be quite successful in certain aspects of building. That's not a traditional material here, obviously. But if it works, then we should perhaps look at some of the building regs and say, well, that would be an acceptable alternative. At the moment, you don't have an alternative because the regs say this is what you have to use. So a bit of creativity would be good. Whether the state can step in as a builder is a question mark. Local authorities don't have the capacity, generally speaking. They don't have the architects, planners, quantity surveyors, and all the rest of it. Even if they wanted to recruit them, where would they come from? They're already employed for the most part. So you'd be taking them from some other part of the economy. So it's not as easy to set this up either at a local level or a national level as it might look. But the state could step in and, possibly come in as a state developer rather than a state builder. And the Land Development Agency is meant to do this to an extent, local authorities do it to an extent, but to increase our capacity to be a not-for-profit state developer, I think there's a lot of potential in that. And looking at where you can then tender to again push down prices, because in the private sector, you've got the developer comes in and they want a profit, and then you've the builder comes in and they need a profit, and that's two layers of profit. If you have a state developer, well, at least you get rid of one of those profit pieces, and you just deal with the builder profit then, which is usually lower than the developer profit. So there's a few things the state, there's a lot of things the state could do. The other one is finance. I understand in the private sector for development, there is still a problem getting finance for some developers, that the central bank clamped down so heavily in 2008 because of the crash, that it's still difficult in some cases for people to get the credit they need to get projects moving faster. So the state could step in strategically to look at that. And I know the central bank is looking at the whole area, but more could be done, I think, from a state again. So whether it's a state developer or even a state development bank, which could step in and make some do some useful things in that space.
A comment here from Haley. I think Nat hits the nail on the head. Need for creativity, community land trusts and development of community-led housing as a mainstream form of tenure could help with the costs involved in developing homes and stop the land speculation.
Yep, I mean, there's no doubt that we can look to what has worked in other jurisdictions, and particularly, different scale will make sense in different places. So when people think about a state development company or a state builder, they're often thinking they're going to step in and build 500 homes here and 1,000 homes there, the huge scale stuff. Whereas we're still going to have a need for housing in the villages, in rural areas. And this is where community land trusts, I think, could be a great vehicle to step in. And that way the state is not trying to do everything and trying to juggle everything possible, but just to kind of move across, have an appropriate solution for different levels of scale. Makes a lot of sense. And on the land speculation, I mean, this is the bit that's infuriating. We had the Kemi report, neither today or yesterday, was it 1973, where Judge Kemi said, look, you need to deal with the cost of land. And what the state needs to do is simply stop giving any planning permission for social housing on land that it doesn't own. So if there's agricultural land at the edge of a town or city that the state wants built on, the state should buy it. The state should buy the land at agricultural prices plus a premium. Judge Kemi said 25%. I wouldn't be so generous at the current price of land. You compulsory purchase, you buy that land. You give people a fair price for it. It's legal in European rules. Once you own the land, then you zone it as residential. It increases in value, but of course you don't have to charge that extra cost in the cost of the housing unit. So you have to deal with land, and the state could have done this, well, ever since it was pointed out in 1973, as most other Western European countries have done, but we just didn't.
Yeah,
and
I think that speaks to a lot of
plunder.
I think that speaks to a lot of the issues that we're currently facing today. It's that kind of lack of forward thinking. So there was one last comment which was relates to a previous answer, but they just wanted to say how succinctly Nat delivers his point. This was excellent. And I think that goes for the whole conversation we've had this morning. I've really enjoyed it. We're now at 2 minutes to 11. So we're even finishing on time, which is remarkable. And I think it's been really interesting and speaks to how important it is to have that broader conversation when we at budget time, and taking the time to do that, I think is a real value. So thank you, Nat. And so with that, I'm going to sign off. Do sign up for the next Simon Talk, and we'll definitely have Nat back again into the future, maybe to unpick more of this.
Thanks
Thanks, everybody.
much.